It was like we were specimens in an exhibit of troublemakers, each of us depicting a different evolutionary stage of delinquent. So when I was a kid, what I lacked in athletic ability, I made up for with a healthy dose of hyperactivity. And for the most part, this boundless energy was harmless, except for those pesky days in the structured environment of 4th grade. That was around the time my dad started getting calls from the school for attention-seeking and destructive behavior. And after they'd had enough, they actually suspended me for a whole week. Now, this had never happened to me before, so I didn't even know what that meant. But I was about to find out. On day 1 of my suspension, I learned we wouldn't be in regular classes. Instead, we were placed with other like-minded students in a small meeting room outside the front office. And this room, it had a giant window facing the front hall where everybody could see the 3 of us. It was like we were specimens in an exhibit of troublemakers, each of us depicting a different evolutionary stage of delinquent. I knew the younger kid by reputation. Earlier that year, he dropped a chocolate bar into the library terrarium. But then the librarian just left it in there, presumably to show us all how unfunny it was to watch the delicate ecosystem die from the toxic chocolate. Months later, flourishing. And it was even funnier because it looked like she was keeping a pet chocolate bar. Still, though, I felt this prank was a product of the earliest form of troublemaker, like early man just learned to use tools. The older kid was a more seasoned hoodlum. I didn't know him personally, but I knew why he was suspended. The week before, he'd set fire to a paper towel dispenser in one of the bathrooms. And he spoke proudly that his technique never failed. Which I assume meant he was a creature of habit, a creature of the later, more evolved, fire-wielding troublemaker tribes. Which also probably made it easy to identify him as the responsible pyromaniac. Was I the missing link between these two? It seemed we each wanted a little attention. But for me, I wanted to show people I was special in some way. Pranks or destructive behavior, those weren't for me. I wanted people to see me as a unique and rare specimen in an exclusive exhibit of my own design. So the next thing I learned about suspension was we wouldn't have recess. That's when we would speak to a counselor. And this counselor wasn't part of the regular school staff. I would have remembered him because he was obese in a way that young kids like me found fascinating. Mr. Warren was a regional counselor that was brought in for special cases. And I had to assume he was some kind of behavioral expert because I couldn't imagine somebody with his outward appearance being hired without excellent credentials. But that also made me feel like he might be a little overqualified for me. I mean, I wanted to be seen as special, but I didn't want special help. After all, the whole reason I was suspended was just a misunderstanding. The idea came to me a few months earlier. One day at recess, I noticed one of the janitors on the roof of the school. He was shuffling around. And then suddenly I noticed all the kids kind of running around and cheering and pointing at him. It was a very special occasion. And then suddenly, as if by magic, he began dropping down baseballs, basketballs, frisbees, Nerf toys. He was clearing the roof of all the toys that had gotten stuck up there over the last few months. It was like Christmas morning, except Santa didn't feel like we were worthy of these muddy rain-soaked toys because he tossed them away from the crowd. But in the scramble, some kids would try to claim a toy they'd personally lost. But when the janitor was finished, the toys were enjoyed by all in the playground that day. Now, the 8-year-old version of me probably wasn't as colorful with that story. I'm sure all Mr. Warren heard was, "I wanted to throw things from the roof." But he just smiled and said it seemed like a fun thing to do. Of course it was. But this was the last thing I expected to hear, considering this was part of the reason I was suspended. But then on the next day of my suspension, I overheard Mr. Warren telling the principal about this story. And apparently, the rest of the school staff weren't aware of this janitor toy tossing tradition. So that was the end of that. I had ruined this special occasion for everyone, forever. So on day 3 of my suspension, I didn't want any more counseling. But Mr. Warren, he had other plans. He asked me to take a walk with him during recess. And if there's anything more embarrassing than being stuck in that little room, it was recess with a chaperone. But Mr. Warren, he was very clever. He knew if we were walking together, I'd want to stay away from the rest of the kids, which would take us to the more secluded corners of the school. Coincidentally, this is where I climbed on the roof. So as we circled the area, I tried to avoid the topic. But we both knew what he wanted to know. See, the janitors would have accessed the roof through off-limits corridors and doors with "Do Not Enter" signs. So even if they were unlocked, there'd be no defying my defiance. But all I needed was a narrow enough gap between two walls, and I could wedge my way all the way up as high as the walls would go. And of course, this also gave me the possibility of plausible deniability. I just wanted to get my ball back. Oh, you're not supposed to climb the walls of a school? So only when the bell rang did Mr. Warren finally stop with the questions. But we didn't follow everybody back inside. Instead, he motioned to a bench near the playground. I noted that before he sat down, he checked the bench for dirt, as if scuffed trousers would be the first thing anybody would notice about him. Mr. Warren wore the same tailored outfit every day. Who was he trying to impress? Here was this colossal man who I assumed had not a friend in the world. And yet, here he was, counseling kids like me. Kids who felt the need to plan elaborate stunts to get noticed by anyone. We sat and watched the classes filling back up with students. It all looked so chaotic. And yet everybody eventually found their place. Mr. Warren asked me if I had a favorite subject and if I looked forward to going back to my regular class. I told him my favorite subject was art. I wasn't particularly good at it, but I felt it was something I could get good at, something I could be known for, unlike what I thought I'd be known for now. This is how Mr. Warren got me to open up, his excellent credentials at work. I told him I wasn't looking forward to going back to my class. I had humiliated myself when all I wanted to do was make people like me. Now I had to tell him the whole story. So after making my way onto the roof, I peeked over the ledge near the playground. Then, like a superhero revealing himself to the world, I looked down at the civilians playing below. I called out, "Hey!" A few kids heard me, but they just looked confused. It hadn't occurred to me I'd have to explain why I was on the roof and yelling at everybody like a maniac. So I picked up the largest toy I could find, a basketball. I held it above my head and called out again. Now, Mr. Warren had me recount what happened next a few times. Everyone said you threw the ball at them. But of course I did. But this is how we learned the janitors weren't playing naughty or nice, having us chase after the toys. They were simply avoiding any accidents by throwing everything away from the crowd. The janitors were professionals. They were the real heroes. I, on the other hand, only enjoyed a few seconds of celebrity before the ball, with its moldy grip, slipped through the hands and slammed directly into a kid's face. The crowd froze. I froze. The crowd looked up at me, then back to the kid, who was covering his face where blood began to drip from his hands. My stomach dropped faster than I could duck back down behind the ledge. Then all I could hear was the sounds of kids running in different directions, yelling for help. And all I could feel was my face getting hotter as my eyes swelled from a flood of overwhelming new consequences. I mean, before this accident, there was a possibility I simply could have gotten away with the stunt. And I was prepared for the repercussions if I didn't. My dad would have been famous. My dad would have been furious. But my dad would have been furious, but I would have been famous. So on the last day of my suspension, I was the last troublemaker left in the little room. Mr. Warren came back to say goodbye. He said he looked forward to seeing my art one day. And then he reassured me that he knew I didn't mean any harm with my stunt. At the time, I didn't realize how much that meant to me. After our week together, I just hope he'd remember me for more than my stunt.